Tarawa Atoll, November 23, 1943. The Pacific sun hangs low, bleeding gold across a shattered coral island. The air is thick, a wet haze of salt, smoke, and decay. Palm trunks lie splintered like matchsticks, charred black from naval bombardment. Every few yards, a helmet glints among the wreckage. Silent proof of the cost of this patch of sand. A squad of U.S. Marines moves cautiously through the ruins of Betio, their boots crunching over coral dust and twisted metal. The fighting has stopped, but the island feels alive with echoes. The faint hiss of distant fires, the moan of a rusted girder shifting in the heat. Then someone spots it. Half buried near a blown-out bunker squats a small Japanese tank. Its paint blistered, tracks half sunk in coral mud. The rising sun emblem still faintly visible on its flank. A Type 95 Heigo, Japan's so-called light tank. The Marines circle it, grinning. One man taps the armor with a knife. "Feels thin," he mutters. Another climbs onto the turret, swinging open the hatch. Inside, cramped, scorched, claustrophobic. Then, for curiosity's sake, they bring up a .50 caliber Browning. The gun barks once. A single round punches through the hull and out the other side. A clean hole of disbelief. Silence. Then laughter. Bitter, relieved laughter. The myth of Japanese armor dies right there. Not in a great battle, but in a moment of stunned realization. That moment, those laughter-filled seconds, marked a turning point in how America understood its enemy. Long before the Marines found that rusted Hago on Tarawa, Japan had built an empire on speed, audacity, and illusion. In the 1930s, while Europe raced toward mechanization, the Japanese army still saw tanks not as independent weapons of decision, but as infantry tools, extensions of the foot soldier. Their wars in China had taught them the wrong lessons. Against poorly armed warlords and nationalist troops, even a light tank seemed unstoppable. The Hago, officially designated Type 95 light tank, was Japan's answer to this early colonial warfare. Small, fast, and cheap to produce. It weighed just 7.4 tons, less than half the mass of an American Stuart light tank. Its armor, 12 millimeters thick at best, could deflect rifle rounds, maybe a light machine gun. But against any anti-tank weapon, it was paper. Inside, the crew of 3 worked in suffocating confinement. The commander doubled as gunner and loader, crouched beneath a turret barely wide enough to turn his shoulders. Its main armament, a Type 94 37mm gun, could destroy trucks and field guns, but struggled even against early Allied armor. Still, in 1939, it looked modern enough. The Japanese army didn't imagine it would face Shermans or Churchills. Its doctrine was built for Asia's vast landscapes. Where infantry ruled, artillery was scarce, and tanks served mostly to terrorize and exploit, not to duel. When the Second Sino-Japanese War erupted, the Hago became the spearhead of Japan's advance. It rolled through dusty Chinese towns, its engines whining, its tracks rattling over wooden bridges. The enemy scattered, often on foot, sometimes on horseback. To Japanese generals, this confirmed their belief. A fast, light tank was all they needed. Industrial limitations reinforced that illusion. Japan's factories, limited by steel supply and outdated machinery, could not mass-produce heavy armor. Their navy consumed most of the nation's metal and fuel. What remained went into ships and aircraft, not tanks. So the army compromised. The Hago wasn't meant to fight equals. It was meant to frighten inferiors. By the early 1940s, Japan's empire stretched across Asia, from the snows of Manchuria to the jungles of Burma. Victories came fast. Malaya fell in 55 days. The Philippines surrendered. Even Singapore, guarded by British pride, collapsed in humiliation. Heigo tanks were there, rumbling down jungle roads, leading infantry through rubber plantations and villages. In Malaya, they shocked British forces who thought tanks couldn't move through dense jungle. But this early success hid the flaw. Japan was fighting the wrong kind of war. While their tanks thrived against colonial garrisons, across the ocean, a new enemy was awakening. One with factories, fuel, and firepower Japan couldn't match. By 1942, the United States entered the war with industrial might beyond comprehension. Within months, the Marines, once scattered and under-equipped, were preparing to storm Pacific Islands defended by tanks that had already become relics. Japan's generals, trapped by old doctrine and short of steel, sent the Hago into the Pacific, believing the same light. Machine that conquered Asia could defend coral atolls against American firepower. They would soon learn how wrong they were. The first real test came on a humid, malarial island, Guadalcanal, 1942, where Japan's light tanks faced American rifles, grenades, and .50 caliber guns for the first time. And there, the myth began to unravel. By late 1942, the Pacific War had transformed from rapid Japanese conquest to brutal attrition. The American counteroffensive began at Guadalcanal, a humid, disease-ridden jungle where logistics mattered as much as bullets. The Japanese sent in their elite infantry, and with them, their light armor. For the first time, U.S. Marines faced the Type 95 Hago in combat. The encounter was brief and devastating. In January 1943, during the Battle of the Tarawa River, several Hago tanks advanced through the palm groves, their engines whining through mud and sand. The Marines, waiting in foxholes with .50 caliber machine guns and 37mm anti-tank guns, opened fire. The results shocked even the Americans. The .50 cal rounds punched clean through the Hago's thin plates, sparking fire inside the crew compartment. The 37mm shells tore through both sides of the tank, exiting with a shriek of molten metal. Within minutes, the Japanese assault collapsed, their tanks burning like paper husks under the canopy of palms. It was a moment of grim revelation. The Marines had feared Japanese tanks might match the Germans. Instead, they found fragile machines that crumpled under basic infantry firepower. Still, Japan persisted. The Hago wasn't withdrawn. It was dug in. Commanders ordered tanks buried up to their turrets in sand, turning them into stationary bunkers. The Hago, once a symbol of mobility, became a coffin, waiting for the next invasion. By 1943, the U.S. island-hopping strategy was in full motion. Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu were next, each defended by entrenched Japanese forces armed with the same outdated tanks. The Americans came prepared. Sherman tanks rolled off landing craft in waves, supported by naval bombardment and flamethrowers. Against this, the Hago's 7.4-ton frame stood no chance. Its 37mm gun couldn't penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor. Its thin hull ignited from a single hit. But even when outclassed, Japanese crews fought with near-suicidal resolve. Many refused to abandon their vehicles, dying at their posts as tanks burned around them. Reports from Tarawa and Roy-Namur describe Japanese tankers continuing to fire until engulfed in flames, their final shots bouncing harmlessly off American armor. To the Marines, the sight was both pitiful and horrifying, a mixture of respect and disbelief. How could a nation capable of Pearl Harbor's precision attacks send men to die in such flimsy machines? The answer lay deep within Japan's military culture, a doctrine that valued spirit over steel, courage over engineering. The Hago was the physical embodiment of that belief, an old weapon still being worshipped as if sheer willpower could stop a bullet. By the time U.S. forces landed on Tarawa in November 1943, the pattern was set. Every island held wrecks of these light tanks, half-buried, blackened, silent. To the Marines, they were curiosities, relics of an empire that had not yet realized the modern world had overtaken it. And yet, inside Japan's military command, few lessons were learned. Rather than rethinking their armor, the Japanese doubled down on defensive warfare, hiding Hago tanks in jungles, tunnels, and caves, waiting to ambush Marines at close range. What began as a war of movement had turned into a war of entrenchment. The Hago, built to race across Asia, now sat still on the sands of Tarawa, obsolete before the battle even began. But from that wreckage, a new understanding was born. For both sides. For the Americans, the Hago proved that victory in the Pacific would be technological as much as tactical. For the Japanese, it marked the slow death of a doctrine that could no longer survive industrial war. As 1944 approached, the U.S. would not only outgun Japan, it would outthink it. And the little Hago tank, once a symbol of empire, would soon become a punchline whispered through Marine ranks. The Hago wasn't a bad tank by accident. It was a tank built for a different kind of war. To understand why it failed, we must first understand what it was meant to do. In the early 1930s, Japan's military strategists studied conflicts in Manchuria and China. They saw the tank not as a weapon of breakthrough like the Germans, but as a fast, lightly armed escort for infantry columns. The goal was mobility, the ability to move across poor roads, rice fields, and jungle paths where heavier vehicles would bog down. Thus, the Type 95 Hago was born in 1935. Its design reflected Japan's constraints and priorities: simplicity, speed, and economy. The armor was made of riveted steel plates, 6 to 12 millimeters thick, lighter than the metal used on most European armored cars. Its diesel engine was reliable and efficient, giving it a range of nearly 200 kilometers, crucial in Asia's fuel-scarce regions. And at just over 7 tons, it could be transported easily by rail or ship, a key factor for Japan's island ambitions. Its 37mm Type 94 gun could destroy any tank China fielded, and even early Allied light tanks like the British Mark VI or American M2A4. But that balance of power would not last. By 1941, the world had changed. The Americans were producing M3 Stuarts and later M4 Shermans, tanks with thicker armor, more powerful guns, and far better optics. The Hago, unchanged since its debut, was hopelessly outmatched. Its most dangerous flaw wasn't its armor, though. It was its crew design. 3 men inside: a driver, a machine gunner, and a commander who was also the gunner and loader. That meant one man had to spot, aim, load, and fire, all while commanding the vehicle. In practice, it made coordination impossible. Under fire, communication broke down, shots went wild, and situational awareness vanished. Japanese engineers knew the tank was outdated, but the Army's leadership, bound by limited industry and rigid hierarchy, refused to delay production. They ordered hundreds of Hagos built instead of risking time on redesigns. By 1942, more than 2,000 had rolled out of factories in Nagoya and Osaka. Most were already obsolete before they reached the front lines. On the battlefield, its weaknesses multiplied. The riveted armor tended to shear off when hit, sending lethal fragments ricocheting inside the cabin, often killing crew even when the shell didn't penetrate. The open-vision ports, designed for visibility in China's plains, became deadly vulnerabilities in the Pacific, where snipers and shrapnel found easy targets. Yet, tactically, Japan still believed the Hago could perform miracles. In Malaya and the Philippines, it did, not because of its design, but because of surprise. The British never expected tanks to maneuver through dense jungle. At Jitra and Kota Bharu, Hagos outflanked enemy lines, crossing rivers and swamps with ease. But that success became a trap. It convinced Japanese commanders that their tank doctrine was perfect. When those same tanks met American Marines on open coral, the illusion collapsed. The Pacific Islands offered no concealment, no roads, and no room for maneuver. The Hago's engine overheated in tropical heat. Its tracks jammed with coral. Its armor cracked under concentrated fire. And when the first 50 caliber bullets tore through its hull, that wasn't just steel breaking, it was doctrine shattering. The tactical failure of the Hago went beyond its metal. It revealed the flaw in Japan's entire strategic thinking. A war machine designed for quick wars, facing a superpower prepared for a long one. But the Hago's story isn't just technical. It's also human. What did it feel like to command one of these fragile machines, knowing you were driving into death? And what did it feel like for the Marines to confront an enemy tank so weak that it seemed unreal? Those emotions, disbelief, respect, pity, form the next part of the story. War is often measured in steel, numbers, and firepower. But behind every machine stands a human face. And in the story of the Hago, that contrast between man and metal is striking. Inside the cramped hull of a Japanese Type 95, there was no room for comfort or even breath. The crew worked shoulder to shoulder, drenched in sweat, suffocating in the heat. The commander's knees brushed the breech of the 37mm gun. The driver stared through a narrow slit, barely wide enough to glimpse the world ahead. Every jolt slammed them into steel walls. Every hit sent shards of molten rivets flying. And yet, they stayed. Japanese crews trained not for survival, but for honor. They were told the tank was their fortress, their tomb if necessary. Better to die inside your machine, one army manual said, than live to see it burn. Many took that to heart. When U.S. Marines encountered destroyed Hagos on Tarawa and Roy Namur, they often found crews still seated, charred, helmets fused to steel, hands frozen on controls. These were not cowards in weak tanks. They were soldiers bound by a code stronger than armor. To the Marines, that realization was unsettling. At first, they laughed. The sight of bullets punching straight through the Hago's hull was absurd. An enemy tank that couldn't stop machine gun fire. But as the laughter faded, respect settled in. These men had fought to the end in vehicles that offered no real chance of survival. Psychologically, it marked a turning point for the Americans. The Japanese were no longer seen as purely cunning or invincible, but as fanatically devoted, dangerously fearless. That combination would shape the Marines' mindset for every island that followed. For the Japanese side, the Hago symbolized the moral paradox of their war. It was both a triumph of ingenuity and a monument to denial, a weapon born from limited industry, worshipped long after it had become obsolete. Commanders clung to the belief that spirit could compensate for weakness, that courage could replace armor, that faith could stop shells, but courage could not weld steel thicker, and spirit could not stop a 50 caliber round. In the jungles and coral fields of the Pacific, the Hago became a tragic emblem of that delusion, a machine whose crews fought bravely, but whose design betrayed them. For the Americans, it became something else, a lesson in how technology shapes perception. They began to see the Pacific War not only as a fight of men and tactics, but of machines and philosophies. The laughter that echoed over that wrecked Hago wasn't mockery. It was disbelief at the vast difference between two worlds of war. And as the battles intensified, from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, from Roy Namur to Saipan, that disbelief would give way to a cold, methodical understanding. The Japanese Armor Corps was not a threat to fear, but a problem to solve. A problem that reached its breaking point in the Pacific's next great confrontation, when the Hago faced not just rifles or 50 cals, but the full weight of American armor and firepower. The moment of collapse had come. The island of Betio, Part of the Tarawa atoll was barely 3 miles long and less than a mile wide. A coral sandbar turned fortress. By November 1943, the Japanese had fortified every inch. Machine gun nests, concrete bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles crisscrossed the beaches. Buried among them, waiting under camouflage nets, were a handful of Type 95 Heigo tanks, the pride of Japan's 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force. When the U.S. Marines landed on November 20th, they came under an inferno of fire. Naval bombardment had flattened the island's surface, but the defenders survived in underground shelters. As landing craft scraped against the coral reef and men waded through chest-deep water, Japanese machine guns shredded the first waves. The beach ran red within minutes. Then, in the chaos of that morning, the Japanese counterattacked. Out from the smoke and palm debris rolled 5 Hago tanks, engines whining like insects in the heat. Their commanders shouted orders through open hatches as they moved toward the landing zone, trying to push the Americans back into the sea. To the exhausted Marines, the sight was surreal. Tanks here on this tiny coral island? They'd expected pillboxes, not armor, but instinct took over. Machine gunners swung their Brownings around, and the heavy .50 calibers began to hammer. The first burst struck the lead Heigo head-on. The bullets didn't ricochet, they passed through. Each impact tore open holes in the thin armor, sparks flashing inside the cabin. One round pierced the driver's compartment. Another hit the fuel tank. Within seconds, the vehicle erupted in flames. The second tank tried to flank right and ran straight into a Sherman. The American M4, its gun steady, fired once. The shell struck the Hago mid-turret, blowing it apart in a spray of armor fragments. The rest halted, their 37mm guns barking futilely against the Sherman's thick fronts. It was over in less than 10 minutes. Every Japanese tank lay burning or silent. The Marines advanced past the smoking wrecks, staring in disbelief. The tanks looked small, almost fragile. The armor was so thin, some Marines used bayonets to punch dents through it. In those moments, the legend of Japanese armor evaporated. Reports later noted that the .50 caliber machine gun had completely penetrated the Heigo at 200 yards, frontally and laterally. Even small arms fire could disable vital components. For the Marines, the laughter that followed wasn't just mockery, it was relief. The Pacific battlefield was unforgiving, but for once they had faced something weaker than themselves. They'd seen enemy planes dive with precision, enemy snipers kill from shadows. But here, the myth cracked. For the Japanese, however, the event was devastating. The Hago had been their most produced tank, a weapon of national pride. Yet in one morning on Tarawa, it proved not just ineffective, but irrelevant. That realization didn't reach Tokyo immediately. But for the soldiers trapped on the island, it was the beginning of the end. Their armor was gone, their fortifications crumbling, and American artillery now ruled the beach. As dusk fell, the sky glowed orange over wrecked coral and smoldering steel. The Hago tanks, twisted and half-buried, became tombs for the men inside. Silent witnesses to a doctrine that had finally met its match. But Tarawa was only the beginning. Because the next great test, Roy Namur, Saipan, Peleliu, would prove once and for all that Japan's armor was finished. 3 months after Tarawa, the Americans struck again, this time at Roy Namur in the Marshall Islands. It was February 1944, and Japan's defensive line was shrinking. The island, a coral strip barely big enough for an airfield, bristled with bunkers, minefields, and more of the same. Type 95 Heigo light tanks, dug in along the runways. When dawn came, the U.S. Navy opened with the most concentrated bombardment the Pacific had seen so far. Battleships and cruisers pounded Roy Namur for hours, turning every palm tree and structure to splinters. Then, under cover of smoke, the 4th Marine Division landed. The Hagos never stood a chance. Some were destroyed before the Marines even reached the beach, flipped over, burned out, or buried under debris. The few that managed to start their engines were cut down by naval rockets, bazookas, and 75 WWII Sherman guns before they could move 50 yards. Combat photographers later captured the aftermath. Twisted hulls, melted tracks, open hatches still glowing with heat. The Marines examined one tank's side and found that a burst from a half-inch machine gun had punched through it in 5 places. Another tank had been holed clean through the turret by a single rifle grenade. The myth was dead. By the summer of 1944 on Saipan, that death was complete. Japan threw everything it had, infantry, artillery, tanks, in one desperate, all-out counterattack known as the Gyokusai Charge, the honorable annihilation. At dawn on June 17, over 30 Japanese tanks, including several Hagos and a handful of heavier Chihas, rolled toward the American lines. Their silhouettes appeared through the morning mist like ghosts from another war. Waiting for them were M4 Shermans, steel giants weighing more than 4 times as much, armed with 75mm cannons. The battle lasted less than an hour. Sherman shells cut through the Japanese formation with surgical precision. Hagos erupted in flames the moment they were hit. Those that reached the Marine positions were met with grenades and flamethrowers. The beach turned into a graveyard of metal, each tank burning like a lantern against the gray sky. When the smoke cleared, more than 20 Japanese tanks lay destroyed. Not a single Sherman was lost. The psychological shift among American troops was profound. In North Africa and Europe, the U.S. Army had feared German panzers. In the Pacific, Marines now realized they dominated the armor battlefield completely. Japanese tanks no longer inspired fear, only pity. Even captured intelligence reports acknowledged the truth. A Japanese officer's notebook, recovered on Saipan, described the Hago as unfit for further use, adding that its gun cannot pierce the enemy tank at any distance. Yet Japan kept building them. Production continued through 1944, not out of confidence but out of necessity. With steel rationed, factories bombed, and design bureaus fragmented, there was no path forward. The Hago was outdated, but it was the only tank Japan could still make in numbers. By late 1944, at Leyte and Luzon, the same scene repeated. Hagos ambushed American convoys, fired once or twice, then vanished in fire and dust. Each engagement ended the same way. Wreckage, silence, and the smell of diesel smoke drifting through the jungle. The Pacific was becoming a graveyard of obsolete machines. And with each battle, the laughter that began at Tarawa turned to grim understanding. The U.S. Marines no longer laughed at the Hago's weakness. They saw it as proof of a war Japan could no longer win. From that point on, the Japanese Tank Corps ceased to be a fighting force. It became a relic, dug into hillsides, buried in caves, or turned into immobile bunkers. The age of mobility had ended. The empire that once sought to conquer Asia on the strength of light armor was now preparing to die, defending its own islands. When the guns fell silent on Betio, Roy Namur, and Saipan, U.S. intelligence officers swept through the ruins with cameras, clipboards, and calipers. Every captured Japanese tank was measured, photographed, and dissected like an artifact from another age. The reports that followed were as brutal as the battles themselves. The Type 95 Hago, they wrote, was lightly armored, poorly armed, and unsuited for sustained operations against modern forces. Its riveted construction, once considered advanced, had become a death sentence. When hit by shell fire, the rivets sheared off and ricocheted inside the crew compartment like shrapnel. The 37mm main gun, effective against trucks or infantry, was useless against American armor. Even the Hago's mobility, its one redeeming trait, faltered on coral sand and swamp terrain, where its narrow tracks dug in and its engine overheated. For the Americans, it was a revelation. Back home, military engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland tested captured Hagos and other Japanese vehicles. They fired 50 caliber rounds, 37mm shells, and bazookas into the armor plates, documenting the results in slow-motion film. One round from a Browning machine gun penetrated clean through both sides of the hull. Another from a Sherman's cannon blew the turret off entirely. In official memoranda, analysts called the Hago a symbol of backward design priorities, but the findings went deeper than mockery. U.S. strategists began to understand why Japan had entered the war with such fragile machines, and what it revealed about its industrial limits. Japan's tank philosophy had always been shaped by geography and empire. In the 1930s, its army fought in China. Vast plains, poor roads, weak resistance. Tanks there were used for infantry support, not duels with other tanks. Lightness and simplicity mattered more than armor thickness. When war expanded into the Pacific, that philosophy never changed, even as the world around it did. Factories in Osaka and Sagami lacked the heavy presses needed to shape thick armor plate. Imports of high-grade steel were limited by Allied blockades. Design bureaus were under pressure to produce quickly, not innovate. So the Hago survived long past its expiration date. Not as a weapon of choice, but of necessity. Captured Japanese engineers later admitted as much. One told American interrogators in 1946, "We understood our tanks could not stand against yours, but we built what we could, not what we wanted." That single sentence, quiet, honest, tragic, summed up Japan's industrial war in miniature. The Americans, in turn, adapted. Realizing that most Japanese tanks posed little threat, the U.S. shifted resources toward infantry support, close air power, and flame weapons, rather than rushing more Shermans into the Pacific. The real enemy wasn't Japanese armor anymore. It was terrain, fortifications, and fanatic defense. And yet, the captured Hago became something more than a failed machine. In training fields across the United States, its battered hulls were used to instruct new Marine and Army tank crews. Young gunners learned to aim, to fire, and to watch how rounds tore through the thin steel. Every hole in those wrecks told a story, not just of one tank, but of an empire that had gambled on speed and discipline over steel and power. By 1945, as Japan braced for invasion, the last Hagos were dug into hillsides, their engines removed, their turrets buried to form concrete bunkers. They were no longer tanks. They were tombs. Each one waited for a battle that never came. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, its empire collapsed in a storm of fire and silence. Cities that once roared with foundry smoke and assembly lines now lay in ruins. Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, all flattened under B-29 raids. The tank factories that had produced the Hago and its successors were gutted shells, their machines twisted by heat, their blueprints scattered in the ashes. The Imperial Japanese Army was dissolved. Every surviving tank, Hago, Chiha, Chinu, was either scrapped, melted down, or hauled away for study. A few were shipped to the United States, where military engineers mounted them in museum-like test pits. The rest were left to rust in the jungles and coral fields where they had fought and failed. But defeat has a way of forcing clarity. In the years after 1945, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, a new generation of engineers, men who had once designed weapons, found themselves designing machines for peace. They applied lessons learned in failure: efficiency, precision, lightness. The same design logic that produced the Hago's compact frame and simple mechanics now shaped automobiles, industrial robots, and transport systems. From the ruins of wartime production rose the foundations of Toyota, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and Komatsu, companies that had once forged armor plates and now forged prosperity. Still, the memory of Japan's wartime armor lingered like a scar beneath the surface. When Japan re-established its self-defense forces in the 1950s, it approached the subject of armored warfare with humility and caution. The first post-war tank, the Type 61, bore little resemblance to the Heigo. It was heavier, stronger, fitted with a 90mm gun, and designed in close cooperation with American advisors. Its steel wasn't meant to conquer. It was meant to defend. By the 1970s, Japan's tank technology had matured far beyond its wartime limits. The Type 74 and later Type 90 emerged as symbols of what the nation had become: technologically advanced, economically powerful, and determined never to repeat the mistakes of its past. And yet, beneath every polished armor plate, there was still an echo of 1943. That moment on Tarawa when U.S. Marines laughed in disbelief as their .50 caliber rounds punched through a Japanese tank. It was an echo that whispered a hard truth. War built on pride and underestimation is war already lost. The Hago was never just a machine. It was a mirror reflecting the contradictions of an empire. Its thin armor showed the limits of ambition without industry. Its light gun revealed the cost of isolation in a world racing toward mechanized war, and its defeat marked the end of an era where courage alone could stand against steel. When historians look back, they do not mock the men who drove those fragile tanks. They see soldiers who fought with what they had, who faced impossible odds with faith and resolve. Their courage was real, but courage cannot change the laws of physics, nor can devotion stop a .50 caliber bullet. The Heigo's wreckage still lies scattered across the Pacific, coral growing through open hatches, roots twisting around gun barrels. In the silence of those forgotten battlefields, its legacy endures not as a symbol of power, but as a lesson written in steel too thin to survive. A lesson Japan would never forget again. The world had moved on, but the story of the Hago and the laughter that greeted its discovery would remain one of the quietest, sharpest reminders of how technology, pride, and misunderstanding shaped the Pacific War. In the vast machinery of the Second World War, the Type 95 Heigo was a small and fragile piece, a thin-skinned relic born from an empire's ambition and its blind spots. It was never meant to fight Shermans or Churchills. It was built for a different kind of war, one that no longer existed when the Pacific ignited. And that is where its tragedy lies. The men who designed it believed in speed, not armor. The soldiers who drove it believed in spirit, not steel. Both believed that courage could substitute for technology, but the battlefield offered no mercy to belief. When the Hago met the modern world, when its rivets split, its plates buckled, and its gun could not pierce, it was not simply a tank being destroyed. It was an idea dying. The illusion that faith alone could withstand progress. Every rusted hull on Tarawa, Saipan, or Luzon stands as quiet testimony to that truth. Beneath the coral and vines lie the remains of a machine that once symbolized national pride, now surrendered to nature and time. Yet out of that defeat came renewal. Japan learned, painfully, that the foundation of strength is not willpower alone, but the fusion of discipline, innovation, and realism. The same precision that failed in war would, within a generation, rebuild a nation of engineers instead of warriors. Today, when one stands before a preserved Hago in a museum, small, almost toy-like compared to the monsters it faced, it feels less like a weapon and more like a warning. A reminder that technology reflects its maker, and when arrogance blinds a nation to its limits, Even steel becomes paper. The Marines who laughed on Tarawa did not laugh at Japan's soldiers. They laughed at the absurdity of war, that men could die inside something so fragile, for something so certain to fall. In the end, the Hago's story is not one of mockery, but of memory. It reminds us that every machine of war carries two legacies: the power it wielded and the lesson it left behind. And for the Hago, that lesson still echoes through history. A nation that underestimates the future will be defeated by it.